everybody, it's Paper Stingray. Thank you so much for checking out this video. Today I'm going to be talking about this piece I did of cloth from the Hollow Knight series. I had a real fun time with this game, and I really enjoyed the moment when they dropped into this battle. So, we're going to get started. As you can see here, I'm working in Affinity Designer. I've got my references loaded into this canvas. I'm working in a 10x10 300 DPI canvas. I started using the square canvas because when I started doing art, I was focusing specifically on Instagram, and I've just kept the square canvas size. One thing I'm sure you'll notice very quickly is that my sketch process on this one is all over the place. I had a very basic idea of what I wanted to accomplish with this piece, but I didn't come into it with much of an idea of the exact composition. When I started this piece, I jumped in drawing the hood, and then very quickly realized that I didn't know exactly how I wanted the bodies to be positioned, so I started a new sketch layer and I roughed out the bodies as quickly as I could. Pretty quickly I settled on wanting cloth to be coming down in a sort of seated position, and I jumped to yet another sketch layer to try to add some finer detail and to really clean up my lines. When working on a sketch, I like to work in a bunch of quick iterations. I find that it helps me get to my final composition much faster. My goal is to knock out a version of the pose, and then lower the opacity and start again with a new layer on top of that and draw it all over again. I find that this is a lot faster for me than refining a single sketch over and over again. At this point I'm pretty happy with how Cloth and the Traitor Lord's drawings have turned out, so I've sketched in the knight. I wanted him down in the corner kind of looking on at this scene in shock. I do a little bit more refining. You'll see me fighting with this hand and how it's holding the club for quite a while throughout this piece, but now it's time for me to move to yet another sketch layer where I'm really going to try to clean things up this time. I can't express enough how much I love working in a digital medium. Being able to take something that you've already drawn and turn it, or move it, resize it, whatever you need to do, without having to just erase it and simply draw it again, really saves a lot of time and effort. You'll see me fuss with the Traitor Lord's position a few different times in this piece. I had a hard time getting this into the perspective that I needed it to be in, and it took me a while to finally find something that I was really happy with. The last thing I do here is I throw in those juicy orange splats. One thing I like to do in any Hollow Knight piece that I'm working on is to include a little bit of that infection. I really like the way that bright orange pops in such a drab setting. Next I move on to sketching out my background. I did make a mistake here, and I drew this on the same layer as my characters. Normally I would have made each character their own layer, and then I would have made the background another layer so that I could turn them on and off as I was working on the vectors. Now, as I jump into the vector work, I went for a background first approach, which is very unlike me. But the one nice thing about working with vectors, and in digital art in general, is that once you make a shape, especially if it's a repeating shape like in the background, you can just copy and paste it as many times as you like. Normally when I'm working with vectors, I tend to work with fills, but when I'm doing something like these straight lines going across the canvas, or the outlines for the windows that you can see here, I like to work with a stroke instead. They give you a nice clean line, and especially with Affinity Designer's defaults, you can get a nice flat clean line. One thing that always surprises me when I'm working, even though it absolutely shouldn't, is that my new shapes will always have some aspect of the old shape attached to them. When I was working on these details on these pillars, they first came with the gradient and the stroke of some previous shapes that I wasn't expecting them to have, so I had to go in and fix that really quickly. I copy and paste the decorative parts of those pillars, and then I move on to the decorative design that I wanted to place inside the window. One of my favorite features of Affinity Designer is their mask feature. So you can create a shape and then nest that shape inside a shape that already exists, and then anything extending outside the bounds of the shape that they're nested inside simply won't appear. So you can see with those circle shapes I created, they extend well past the window, but they only appear within the fill of the window itself. Here I'm adding some shadow to the background pieces. I'll talk about this a little bit more in detail later, as this is a major part of my style, but for now I'm just trying to add a little more detail so that the shapes of the background really stand out. And here you'll see me selecting everything and giving it a little bit of a blur so that it recedes into the background. And now I'm finally moving on to the characters. This is always my favorite part of a piece. So, as you can see, whenever I'm working on characters, anything that I'm planning on adding a shadow to, I will make any piece that I expect to overlap with another piece into its own layer. Because I don't want the eyes of the hood to look like they are sitting on top of it, when in fact they would be recessed into it, I'm actually going to make those eye shapes, I'm going to copy them, and then I'm going to subtract them out of the hood shape. The copies of the eye shapes will then sit behind the hood shape, so that when it casts its shadow, it'll cast it onto those eyes, giving them a little bit of depth. can see, as I go through here making these shapes for the body, every single color and every single separate piece becomes its own separate shape. Each one of those shapes comprises its own separate layer, and I arrange those layers as if they were pieces of paper stacked on top of each other. Here I start to really freehand with the club, working to make sure that its shape looks like that it's an actual bent physical object, and also just adding some details to make it look a little more interesting. Like I described with the eyes, on the side of the club I wanted these notches to look like they were receding into the club, so I made copies of each one, I subtracted them from the shape that was going to be in front, and then I moved the copies behind the shape itself. In doing this, I create these darker grooves that will have a shadow on them, giving them that recessed look that I'm trying to accomplish. With cloth done, I'm now going to move on to the Traitor Lord. One thing you're going to see me mess with is the shape of this head. I was never quite happy with how this looked in perspective, and you'll see me playing with it quite a bit. One nice thing about this character was that a lot of it was actually going to be hidden by this club, so I didn't have to worry too much about making it perfect. Here you can see I've used the mask trick again to add the lines to the body, and then mapping in the arms and the legs. The legs are another piece I work on quite a bit from my sketch, because again, they didn't really fit in perspective, and when I turned on the background, it almost looked like it was laying up above the ground. As I start to add in these splashes of infection, I have to be really careful where my layers are going. Some of it falls under the Traitor Lord, while some of it is going to fall on top of the Traitor Lord. Because I use the shadow trick in my art, I tend not to add a lot of shadows to the pieces, but I will add highlight like this to anything that is liquid. And last but not least, we will throw the knight into the corner here. He's a pretty simple character in this piece because he is mostly off screen and he's got his back turned to the viewer, so he's able to pop in really quickly. Now for each character in this piece, I'm going to go through and select every layer that makes up the character themselves, and I'm going to right click and duplicate those layers. The one thing that's really important is that you want to use duplicate rather than copy and paste, because as you'll see, when I duplicate layers, it creates a copy of it right above the original. But if I use the copy and paste feature, it will make a chunk of those layers above the others, and they'll need to be redistributed. Each layer that's being copied needs to be right below the one that it was created from. So with Cloth, the Knight, and the Mantis Lord's body, I'll be using black shadows, but to add a little bit more of a glow to the infection liquid, I will actually use a dark orange glow. You'll see me switch back and forth between the design persona and the pixel persona in this drawing, and what I'm doing is I'm going into the pixel persona and I'm using the eraser. I'm selecting the layers that have shadows, and anywhere that I didn't want a shadow to be, like at the bottom of the knight's horn, I will actually go in and erase that. And what we have here is the finished piece. Overall, I'm really happy with how it came out. That Mantis Lord really deserves a good whack in the head. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed this video and you'd like to see more, please like and subscribe. If you have characters you'd like to see me work on in the future, please leave them down in the comments below. So long everyone, this is Paper Stingray saying I hope you have a beautiful day.